Good evening and welcome to the Dr. and Mrs. Satti, Paddi, and Parvati Reddy Memorial Lecture. My name's Travis Fridgen. I'm the Interim Dean of Science. This lecture series was established through generous gifts from the Drs. Satti Bhattari and Suresh Reddy in honor of their parents, the late Dr. and Mrs. Satti Paddi and Parvati Reddy. I extend a special welcome to the family and friends and former colleagues of Dr. and Mrs. Reddy who are here with us this evening. Dr. Reddy was a faculty member and former head of the Department of Physics and Physical Oceanography and a professor emeritus. He became a citizen of Newfoundland and Labrador in 1963 and was a distinguished scholar of the Fellow of the Institute of Physics in London. In addition to his passion for research and teaching, he was a proponent of volunteerism, serving in health and educational activities, community and citizenship organizations, as well as human rights, ethnic diversity, cultural development, and national unity associations. Dr. Reddy was also a founding member of the Friends of India Association, the Ethno-Cultural Association of Newfoundland, and the Chinmaya Mission of St. John's. The purpose of the Dr. and Mrs. Satti Paddi and Parvati Reddy Memorial Lecture is to attract a well-spoken leader in the broadly defined area of physics research or discovery with the goal of providing wide-reaching benefit to both the general public and the university community. I'd like to express our sincere thanks on behalf of the Faculty of Science and the Department of Physics and Physical Oceanography for the Reddy family's generosity. And Dr. Len Zedel, the head of Physics and Physical Oceanography, will now introduce tonight's guest lecturer, Dr. Normand Mousseau from the University of Montreal.
Thank you, Travis. So our Reddy lecturer this year is Dr. Normand Mousseau, who's a theoretical physicist working in the area of complex materials and proteins, and, apropos tonight's presentation, energy and natural resources. Dr. Mousseau is full professor in the Department of Physics at the Université de Montréal. He is the current academic director of the Trottier Energy Institute at Polytechnique Montreal. And while his CV recounts a long list of academic contributions, I'll just highlight his service as a co-chair of Quebec's Commission on Energy Issues in 2013, and he is a founding member of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choice. Dr. Mousseau is interested in popularizing science, and in this regard, he hosts a radio show called Le Grand Écueil Jaune. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Mousseau, who will present Reaching Our Climate Goals, How Net Zero Changes Everything.
Is that oops. Sorry. Okay. I think it will be easier on your ears. So thank you very much, Misha. Thank you very much to the department and the faculty for inviting me today, for you to be here. I'm really glad to be here. It's my first time in Newfoundland and Labrador, so it's really a nice visit. So I will be talking indeed about the work I'm doing on energy issues based on modeling, technico-economic modeling I will be describing, and trying to explain to you how really the new goals we've adopted in Canada, which is net zero for 2050, we adopted that 2 years ago, forcing us to rethink a lot of the actions we were planning for for decreasing emissions. So that's the goal. We already mentioned, so I will skip. I'm indeed, by day, I'm a physicist who does modeling also, but at the atomic scale of complex systems. I'll be giving a talk tomorrow about that, so I'll save you that tonight. So for those of you who are not into physics, I regret, but you will not, I'll skip that. Okay. I'm also a scientific director of the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier, which is an institute that was created at the Engineering School Polytechnique Montréal by a generous donation from the Family Foundation Trottier, which has the mandate to support energy transition. And the Trottier family, the money comes from electronics, so there's no attachment to one particular form of energy. So we're really not promoting any technology or any direction. It's really how do we think, how do we move on the energy transition. And so there's a part where we give scholarships to students. We also support some research, but we are very active in trying to help Canada move forward. Okay. And I'll just demonstrate a bit how. Now, we've been working hard, but also at the federal level, there's been some efforts to structure the capacity to think properly about the challenges in order to move forward. And that will be, I would say, a big theme of my talk today, is how we cannot just wish the energy transition. We cannot just wish to be at zero, okay? This is a process that requires thinking, planning, strategic approach, understanding the science behind, understanding what's possible, and taking risks, okay? So over the last few years, at the federal level, there's been some efforts to structure things, and I've been involved in a few of those endeavors. So we just created less than a year ago, a structure which is called Energy Modeling Hub. And this structure has the mandate to support energy modeling, not at the quantum level, it's really systems level, like city level, transportation, energy sectors, or things like this. And to get models up and available to the policymakers, to the public, to be able to discuss quantitatively about issues that we are facing. So this structure is funded by Natural Resource Canada, and it's just starting, but the hope is really to have sets of models at different levels to be able to accompany decision makers at the federal level, at the provincial level, at the municipal community level, to be able to make right decisions. Or at least, there's no the right decision. There's a number of decisions, but at least to make coherent decisions, let me call it this way. I've also been involved in the creation of the Canadian Climate Institute. It changed its name. It used to be Climate Choices. A year ago, it changed to Climate Institute. This is funded by Environment Canada, and its mandate is to do policy advice. So essentially, this is a structure with maybe 50 people, analysts, people in communication, so trying to analyze what are the best approach, best practices, and how can we move forward. Okay, so they publish a lot. There's really an advisory board, but really with solid advice. So I encourage you to go and look at their website. They're really active. They're really doing excellent communication and analysis work. I've also co-created the Transition Accelerator, which is another structure. This one is a not-for-profit organization funded initially by philanthropic organizations. And its mandate is really to work to decarbonize economic sectors. So we are working, for example, in Alberta. We have created a hydrogen hub. It's not me, I'm not working. I've kind of created this, but it's running. But the idea is that we're working on using blue hydrogen there, which is hydrogen made from methane, but with sequestration, to help decarbonize the economy of Alberta. Okay, so we're working with transportation industry, with oil and gas industry, with heating industry, so people who need heat, to kind of work forward and say, how can we use this to get people to transform the energy sector there? We also present, for example, on electricity. How can we just created a national organization called Canada Grid, to help to help decarbonize, accelerate the decarbonizing of the energy grid, the electricity grid in Canada, for example. And I don't do a radio show anymore. Somehow I don't have time these days to do my radio show. But so I've been more into writing books. But that's not the topic. Okay, so let's get back on the topic of the day. So how net zero changes everything. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to present you some of the work from our Energy Outlook. So we've been publishing a series of Energy Outlook. The series has two issues. At the moment, we're preparing the 2023 edition of this Canadian Energy Outlook. I'll explain what it is and how we move forward. I'll discuss also the 2030 emission reduction plan a bit that Canada has been put forward, and discuss about reality, what can we expect, and how we should move forward. Okay. And this is based on modeling. So modeling is important to understand issues. It doesn't give you the final answer. Answer is about, or choices about values or about political balance, but you need to be enlightened and understand issues, and that's where modeling helps you. Okay. So the Canadian Energy Outlook, you can look at it. It's a few hundred pages. It's easy to find. It's a second edition. So we've published the first one in 2018, where we were very bold at that time, and we're projecting reduction of up to 80% of the emissions in 2050. Okay, that was beyond what the federal plan was at that point. 2 years later, we changed that. It's for 100%. It has to be zero by 2050. So things are moving quickly in terms of, I would say, targets. Okay? Not necessarily in terms of reaching the targets, but in terms of adopting targets, we're moving quickly. Okay? And if you saw yesterday, for example, the IPCC report, it's not a surprise because we had done some preview of that last fall and last year. But essentially what we're saying is that from the climate side, things are heating up, and from the policy side, the world is not aligned to meet its target. Okay? I'm not a climatologist. I don't have any scientific position. I have my own personal, but no scientific position on what should be the targets. Okay? My goal is once government set target, I can come in and say, are you there or not? Are you making the transformation or not? And what are the most efficient ways to get to the targets? That's where I'm active. Okay. The type of work we're doing, this Outlook, is not unique. Almost every place in the world does these. Every developed place in the world does this type of modeling exercises to understand what's happening. So that's the Net Zero America that was done by Princeton, published a year ago. It's done in Europe. It's done in most places. Canada used to do it itself, the government, but stopped doing it maybe 15 years ago. So we are doing it on our to kind of help understand what's the issue. So let's first, because you're not all energy experts, I guess you might have other things to do in your life. Don't ask me, I don't understand why, because energy is such an exciting topic. But I can accept that you might not spend all your evening looking at that, so all your evenings. So where are we? So Canada is among the largest energy producer and exporter. This is something we forget sometimes, okay? We are really, if you look at the numbers, for example, okay, we are third in the world for production. Proven reserve, proven capacity, fourth in the world for production and export. Okay, in uranium, we are the second in terms of production in the world. Okay, uranium, we tend to forget that's energy, but no, for physicists, it's kind of we tend to realize that. Electricity, coal. So we are a big player in Canada in terms of production. We are not a big player politically. Okay, we don't have the weight of Saudi Arabia. In large part because we have a single client, which is the U.S., okay? And if you have a single client, you have no power. Power comes from having a lot of clients. So essentially, we are depending on the U.S. to decide do they want to buy it or not. And if they don't buy it, we don't sell it. That's what happened with the natural gas. But for oil, they're buying a lot of it. So what else do we have? Electricity is very clean in Canada. It's very clean here, you know that. So 81% of electricity in Canada is decarbonized, okay, which is essentially the highest of large countries in the world, okay. Almost nobody gets close to that. Okay. Which means that we have problems because most countries, the first thing you do to reduce emissions is to decarbonize your electricity. Well, it's hard to do that in Canada. So we have to do other things to decarbonize. Okay. Have one of the highest level of energy consumption per capita in the world. Okay, some of it is explainable, some of this are justifiable, some of it less. There's huge variation, and I'll show it later in my talk between the provinces. Okay, and Canada plays very little role because we have a single client, largely, on the oil price at the world level. Okay, also because we are a bit boring, so we don't have wars or things like this in Canada. Everything goes smoothly, so we produce day in and day out, and now things work. And no, that removes a bit of the capacity to disturb the world, which is probably a good thing. What I'm showing here is called a Sankey diagram, which is a flow of energy from the production on that side to consumption on that side. The numbers are way too small, so you cannot see anything. But essentially, what you see on this side, the first line, that's about 2/3, is energy production. So we produce 22,000 petajoule of energy. I know you don't know what a petajoule is. Doesn't matter. So 22, that's the number 1,000. And we export about 11. So half of the energy we produce in Canada is exported. A total energy, okay, including electricity and everything. So that's where we are. And a good part of the energy is also wasted. So out of the 11,000 petajoule we are consuming, okay, almost 4,000, okay, almost a third of all the energy we're consuming is lost, okay. If you drive your car, 80% of the energy that you're burning is just gone in heat and doesn't help move the car, okay. And that's it, and every time you use essentially oil and gas for electricity or for work, that's the physics part. For those of you who are not physicists, that's my little physics course. You know, if you transform energy or heat in work, you always lose. Okay, that's Carnot who says that. You cannot win on that. So if you use electricity from hydroelectricity, the hydroelectricity is a turbine that rotates, so essentially that works. This is work, and then the electron moving is work. So you have work all the way through. That's a much more useful type of energy than heat. Okay, so you lose much less of that as you consume the energy. So the energy consumption in Canada has been going slightly up over 20 years, as you see here. Okay, we use about 35% of the energy we consume is oil. 30% is 5%. If you do the total, it's 70% of the energy we consume in Canada, which is fossil fuels. It's less than the average on the world, which is about 85%, 83%, but it's still a lot. So when we're talking about decarbonizing, it means that we have to change at least 70% of the energy use that we're doing, the energy system in Canada. It's huge, okay? And in 27 years this year, okay? So it's short. So how do we link that to emissions? Because we don't really care, we didn't care about oil or gas, especially since we have shale gas and shale oil, and there's a lot of oil and gas available on the planet. The issue is emissions. So the issue is that, of course, burning this creates CO2, and not burning it creates methane. That is also a problem. And the issue here is, how can we reduce emissions? So in Canada, emissions have between 1990 and 2000 roughly have gone up by 21%, and they have been roughly stable until 2019. 2020, there's been a drop because of the pandemic and everybody was forced to stay home, couldn't move or whatever, so that drops. But what we see this year is that's bouncing back largely. Okay, there's some debate about how much. Some people say we bounced back only half of what we lost. It's not so clear. I'm kind of suspect it's mostly will catch up on everything. Okay? Because over the during the pandemic, we didn't do any structural change in our use of energy. Okay? We do a bit more, we stay a bit more at home, but that's about it, and that doesn't have such an impact. If you look at Canada's emission, between 1990 and 2019, the emission grew 21%, and today, the energy is responsible in Canada for 81% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why an energy specialist like me is relevant, okay, for now. And what's left is agriculture at the top and waste, okay? Those are not emissions linked to fertilizer and things like this, okay? So there's a lot. So we often say, okay, the bad guys are south of the border, okay? In fact, the US had in 2019, the same emission in 1990. In Canada, it went up by 21%. We are the only G7 country to have its emission grow, okay? Everybody either stayed flat or decreased significantly. Canada is in the opposite direction. Okay. So for those who have forgotten or didn't pay attention, so Canada has adopted goals 2 years ago in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. A goal of reduction of 40 to 45% from 2005, so roughly 2019 is the same. So 40 to 45% reduction and 100% reduction called net zero, and I'll explain what net zero is, by 2050. Okay. So that's quite stringent. Okay. It had put a carbon price on to help. So the carbon price started at $50. It should be about $70 this year, and it should go up to $170 a ton of CO2 by 2030. There's also, in terms of renewable, essentially we're waiting. We should have the regulation announced soon, but how we will enforce net zero, so zero emission in the electricity sector by 2035, okay? And we'll abandon coal. That doesn't really worry you too much. There's also all cars will have to be zero emission by 2035. All new cars will have to be zero emission. And there's a number of other things, for example, reducing methane, which is not insignificant. Okay. It's complicated. You know, Canada is always complicated. So what I'm telling you in terms of regulation, all this applies to various provinces in different ways. Okay. So those are just to make you to see how things are. And I think some of these things have changed since I typed it, because I think what is it? Nova Scotia, New Brunswick is now in the federal backstop. So it's a complicated business. So understanding how we move forward is not easy. Okay. So let me also tell you a bit about the Newfoundland and Labrador. If you look at emissions, so emissions have been reasonably flat between 1990 and 2020, but 2020 is a strange year. I didn't have the numbers for 2019. Okay. And what you see here is that electricity is responsible for 12% of the emissions, mostly because you have still oil, where is it? The Holyrood thermal generating station that works from time to time. You have transportation is responsible for 41% of all the emissions in Newfoundland and Labrador, which means it's not easy to decarbonize this, because there's a lot of vehicles or ships and all this to decarbonize. And you have industry, which is largely the mining industry, which is responsible for 10%. Okay. Building is a bit less, and so you see the heating of the building is not so large here. Okay. In terms of emission, you still are slightly above Canada's average, okay, at 18 tons of CO2 per capita, which is fairly high with respect to Europe, for example, where we're talking about 5-6 tons, for example, if you want to compare. So now, let me tell you about the exciting stuff, which is the modeling, of course, so the outlook that we've done. So we looked at 5 scenarios. As usual in these things, you have something called business as usual or reference scenario, which is if you did nothing and you just let things run their way, how would that happen? Of course, things never run their way because there are things moving around, but that's how we have to do it. And then everything is kind of measured with respect to this reference scenario. So CP30 is putting a tax on carbon of 170. That's already in the law, but when we did the modeling, it was not in the law. So we'll look at CP30. And then net zero scenarios where we impose net zero in 2045, 2050, or 2060. Okay. And we use a complex model with thousands of technologies for producing energy, for transmitting energy, for transforming energy, and for using energy. So we have now hundreds of vehicles, for example, of various technologies with prices. And this is an optimization model. So what we do is that, given the constraints, say, on greenhouse gas emission, optimize all the investments to lead to that goal. Okay? So we model a straight line in terms of emissions between now and, say, 2050 that we see here. And then we say, given this, optimize investment with the growth in population, growth in GDP, standard, the current industry, and all this. Okay, so that's a model that is fairly heavy with a lot of assumptions. Okay, with prices. So we say, okay, that technology, the price should go down by 2% per year. That technology is mature; it doesn't go down. So there's really a lot of details. There's capital, operating, fuel costs, etc. And we have results at the provincial level also. So those are the GHG emission. What is interesting is that the price on carbon alone in our model, because it's not a purely economic model, we use technology too, the price on carbon has not so much impact. That's the blue line. The purple line, CP30, doesn't have such a huge impact on getting us to our goals. Okay, we decrease a bit the emissions with respect to the reference scenario, but we're far from zero. Okay, the zero is the line at the bottom here. Okay. So let us look at what we get in terms of results. So there's a lot of bars, so don't worry too much. Okay, what is interesting first is if you look by 2030 already, the last three scenarios, so NZ 60, 50, 45, you see there's a strong reduction in energy use. Okay, sorry, that's the emissions here. But a strong reduction in emissions because we impose it. Okay, how does that happen? I'll show you later, but essentially it happens because the only way we can manage to decrease emission at the depth promised by the federal by 2030 is to decrease oil and gas production by 60%. Okay. Economically, that's the only thing we see that can happen. Okay, that's huge. Okay, and of course, it's mostly in the West, so you're not so much touched because the emissions are much larger per barrel, with tar sands than with the technology here. And when you move to 2050, what you see is you don't see a bar which is at zero. Okay, what do you see instead? Okay, what you see is that green and above, you see there are lines above zero and things below zero. Okay, so it's called net zero for that reason. There are sectors that we don't know at the moment. We don't have technologies to decarbonize. So what do? We compensate these by capturing emissions somewhere, sequestering, but it have to be negative emission. So there's two ways roughly to do that. One way is called biomass carbon capture and sequestration in electricity. So we burn wood, roughly, if I simplify, and we take the emissions from this combustion and bury them under the ground. Okay, we consider that the wood has zero emission because as the tree grew, it kind of captured CO2 from the atmosphere. And as we capture this and sequester it, that's a negative emission. So that compensates the emissions that we cannot capture somewhere else. Okay, we cannot reduce somewhere else. And when we cannot do this, because there's not enough biomass in Canada to capture everything, we go to our own backstop, which is called direct air capture. Okay, so you put large kind of turbines that go in the air, and then when air goes through, you capture the CO2 from the air, and then you condense it and sequester it. Okay. What's the cost of the technology? We don't know, okay, because there's no technology at large scale that does that. Okay, so what we do it as the last straw. So we put a large price on that, and when you have done everything else, that's what's left. Okay. And when you look at the number, they are astronomical. In negative emission, we need 125 million tons of negative emission per year. Okay. Plus, we do capture and sequestration, which is simply zero. It's not negative, another 70 million ton or so. So in Canada, we have 700 million ton today of emissions. By 2050, our modeling tells us we would need to capture and sequester 200 million ton. So 30% of all the emissions in Canada. This is huge, okay? And often when I give the talk, and I already give you, people say, why are you pushing for CCS, carbon capture and sequestration? I'm not pushing for anything, okay? I'm just saying when we put the technologies available with the prices we have today, and we foresee in these models, that's what comes out. If you don't like CCS, work on another solution and quick, okay? That's all I can tell you, okay? So we're not in the prediction, so I'm not a meteorologist. I don't predict what will happen in 2050. Those are projections, given what we know today, and we say we invest the most wisely possible, the wisest way possible, that's what should happen, okay? Again, we never invest the wisest way possible, so that's already a big limitation on this. And second, things will change, and people will like stuff and not like stuff. And so that's the issue. But it will not be easy. If you look at the transformation of the energy consumption, we're consuming 11,000 petajoule today. What you see is that when you put net zero, look at the energy consumption. The energy consumption when you reach net zero is lower than if you don't do it. Why? Because we electrify a lot of the stuff, and electricity is so much more efficient. If you drive an electric car, it requires a third of the energy that you have for a fossil fuel, a combustion car. A third. So it's 3 times more efficient. So that's why we are more efficient, okay? And also because we're producing less oil and gas, mostly oil from the tar sand, which requires a lot of energy. So on this scale, we see it, okay? By reducing production of the tar sands, we are seeing a reduction here. Now, if I look here, that's the primary energy production. So what I was showing you before is the consumption. That's what is being produced in Canada. As I was showing you, our models to reach the targets that the federal level has given itself, the only way we see that is the major reduction in production. In fact, there are other ways. You could say, the industry could say, we'll do carbon capture and sequestration. And if you've seen ads, I'm not sure if they run here, but they run in Quebec all the time, ads from the tar sand industry in Alberta, who say, we'll be clean and green and we'll capture all the CO2 from our production. If they did that, we don't care. That would be zero. We're happy. So our model doesn't impose that you have to reduce production, but it's just when we look at the cost, that's what we do in these models, we don't see CCS as being competitive for oil and gas industry. Okay. But again, that's a model with enough subsidies from all of us. It will be manageable to do CCS. Okay. So we'll see if that works. But this industry, the oil and gas industry, has promised a lot of investments, tens of billions of dollars in CCS. At the moment, they still haven't put a single dime on the table. So by 2030, in 7 years, they will need to start investing massively and rapidly to be able to reach these targets. Okay. If you look at electricity production, without surprise, if we move oil and gas away and we replace it by electricity, we need more electricity. Okay? No surprise. But what is surprising is that, I remind you, 70% of all the energy used in Canada today is from oil and gas and coal. Okay? If we replace all of this by electricity, you only need to double the electricity needed in Canada. Okay? Because electricity is so more productive. Okay? So it looks a lot. We need to more than double, slightly more, 2.1. Okay? But it's not so bad, in fact, given how much energy we replace for that. everybody has focused on the fact that we need to double, forgetting that we're reducing energy somewhere else. So those are what we get in net zero for Canada. Okay, electricity production by 2030. Mostly our modeling shows we could reduce by being more efficient. If you put heat pumps in heating buildings, you reduce energy consumption significantly, for example, with the same service, so things like that. You see that buildings decarbonize almost totally by 2050 if we want to reach our goals. You see that industry electrifies by a lot, by about 50%, but industry also uses a lot of biomass, for example, so that will be used. It also will do some carbon capture sequestration, okay? So that's part of it. Transportation, you see, has so much difficulty to electrify. The problem is that we don't have the technologies to put in our models. If you ask me what the prices are of heavy truck which run on electricity or hydrogen or whatever, I don't know the prices, okay? So I cannot put them in the model, because there's nothing that runs today where we can say, okay, you have some confidence of a clue of how much it will cost, how much the infrastructure will cost to support that. So I cannot put them in the model. So I don't say it cannot happen, but what we're saying is that there are blind spots here, and we better look at them rapidly to understand what we should do there. Okay. So these transformations take place. That's, for example, the building sector. You see how it decarbonizes. And look at the yellow. The yellow line is natural gas. You don't use much natural gas here, but natural gas is used in heating buildings, okay? And industry still pretends today that it's a transition fuel, okay? We don't see natural gas anywhere in our modeling as a transition fuel, which means there's no sector where natural gas increases its share over the next few years. It's on the reduction path in every single sector it's being used in order to reach net zero. Okay? So there's no transition. The only ways you have to transition out of natural gas and fossil fuels. Okay? Again, it's not formally my position. It's what we get from the modeling. Okay? So let's be clear. Okay? The same thing, that's the sector. You see the industrial sector is transforming, but there's a lot of various sources. Here you can see natural gas will remain in some sector, bioenergy, all type of stuff, okay? And same thing for transportation. Transportation, you see in gray, in purple is aviation fuel. We don't see how to decarbonize everything in this sector at the moment. So we need to compensate somewhere else, okay? And that's interesting. The oil and gas, okay? The oil and gas will need to electrify quite a lot of its production, whatever will be left, okay? So instead of using fossil fuel to generate heat and generate energy to decarbonize, to reduce its emission, it will also have to electrify, okay? That's kind of fun. That's fun because I'm not working in this industry, but I now have it's easy to be a university and academics on these things. So let's look at our modeling for sorry, I'll get there. Newfoundland and Labrador. So what do we look at? This is emissions as a function of year. What you see is that you're always above zero. So we don't see how you decarbonize fully in Newfoundland and Labrador with the technologies, actually. So there's about 2 million tons left out of about 13 by 2050. That will have to be compensated somewhere else in Canada, okay, to be zero. What you look at here is because transportation is a heavy. You remember that 40% of your emission come from transportation. We don't know how to decarbonize fully transportation, and you have a lot of biomass. But to do net zero negative emissions, we don't want to just burn the biomass and do nothing. So we use the biomass with industry or electricity production. But there's so much electricity already here, and the industry is not so heavy, so you cannot use all the biomass. So there's no way you can do these negative emissions with recuperating the heat, okay, in the way we're modeling it. I don't say it's impossible, but that's the limit of our models, okay. And so that's you see your mostly hydroelectric by the 2050. If you look at biomass, you'll use some biomass. Mostly from forest waste, okay? But there's not so much. It looks a lot, is 12 terajoules, is not a lot of energy. Okay. So now, some observations. Okay. Let me remind you, when I say net zero is everything, you cannot think of decarbonizing the society by 80% here, 20% there, 30% there, and get to zero. Okay? Zero means you have to decarbonize everything fully. Okay? And so all the partial reductions are incompatible with net zero. You have to do, if you change the technology, it's not, I change my oil furnace for a better oil furnace, you're not on the path to net zero. If you remove your oil furnace, it has to go to electricity, okay, or biomass. Because there's so much capture and sequestration. You see 200 million tons in Canada, 30% of all its emission today. You have to decarbonize whatever you can, not counting first on CCS, okay? First, do whatever you can to get out of fossil fuels. Okay? The other way, it doesn't work. Okay? Energy efficiency is something that is still very fashionable among people. Let's be more efficient, okay? It doesn't match what we need to do. Being more efficient, again, is changing my oil furnace for a more efficient oil furnace. That's not what we need to do. We need to change energy source. And if this energy source is less efficient, who cares? If it's net zero or zero, you are on the right path. Okay? And that is something people have a lot of problem understanding, especially in the energy sector. If you're outside of it, you don't know. But people have grown on energy. Now, the right thing to do is be efficient. Okay, that's kind of people. Most of you are too young, but some of you might remember that there were some oil crises in the 70s and the 80s. Okay, end of 70s, and everybody moved to energy efficiency. That was the key word. We are not in the energy efficiency. We are in the change of energy. Okay. And it's important because otherwise we're spending a lot of effort on stuff that is useless. Now, making your house more efficient by insulating it, it's great. But if you're already heating with electricity, who cares? Okay, you're already zero. Let's keep that money for something else that brings you to zero. No, rough edges, but it's roughly right. Okay? The end of the world is not in 2050. Okay? Especially for the young people, I won't be there probably, so it doesn't matter to me. But no, 2050 is not the end of the world. Okay, it is not like 2012 for the Aztecs or Maya, Africa. The world will end. Okay, terrible destruction. So let's get there, do our best, and whatever is not done perfectly, let's continue. Okay, so that's what I would say. Even if you get to net zero in 2050. If you look at the curves and the black and the lines, you see they're changing. As we move forward, technology changes, continue to change. So even if you're a net zero world, the energy system will continue to transform. Okay? It's not the end of history. So let's understand this, and that means that let's do stuff. If we get it wrong, let's correct it. Okay? If we say, well, we're not sure that everything is right, that's the best way to never do anything. Okay? So we have to take risk, we have to make mistake, we have to correct ourselves. That's how we can move. Okay. That's maybe clearer here if you look at the curves that things are continuing to change. Okay. We need to be more effective. Okay. One of the things is amazing. Okay, let me show these curves. It's very hard, so I'll try to explain them because I'm not very good at graphics. So, in 2018, we did the first outlook where we looked at the reduction of 80% of the emissions in the energy sector. That corresponds to about half of the emissions in the whole of Canada. Okay, all emissions, including agricultural waste and everything, when you reduce by 80%, a bit more, 60% about of the emissions. Okay, that's the orange line. Tells you the cost, which is called the marginal cost, the cost of the last ton of CO2 that I have removed. Okay? So the last ton to reach 80% of emissions in the energy sector in 2018 was about $1,200. Okay? To remove my last ton to get to 80% reduction. Now look at the numbers for the 2021 outlook. Okay? When I reach 60% of the emission, The last ton now costs me only $300. Okay? In 3 years, technology cost and our projections of various technologies available mean that the projected cost for 2050 dropped by a factor 3, a 4, okay? Because from 1,200 to 300, okay? It's huge. At the same marginal price now is the price of removing the last ton of CO2 in Canada overall, okay? $1,200 a ton. So this is amazing. It tells you that things are moving quickly and there's no reason to sit on your hand. Let's move, because as we transform, if we start with the cheapest ways today, by the time we get to 2050, we have a lot of solutions that will be available to us, okay? So we should not wait. Let's move on. Let's do what we can do easily. And let's understand that the new hired here, for example, at the university, are probably as intelligent as the people who were already here, okay? So the solution we didn't find, and probably better, no? So the solution we didn't find will be found by the younger people, okay? That's how the world works. So we should not imagine that we are the only bright people will all stop today, and from now to 2050, no bright person will have idea, okay? That's not how it works, hopefully, okay? So we have to count on that. And in 3 years, that's what we show. So we are waiting to see what will happen with our new outlook, how much it will change. Okay? So, nevertheless, these things don't happen by themselves. Okay? There's called inertia, the force of habit. Okay? If I have an industry and I have a process that I could electrify, but I use heating oil at the moment, why am I not doing it? Well, my first worry is, will I have the workers? Okay? I have 3 people leaving my company every month. I have to hire them, new people to replace them. I have to make sure I have to make sure that when I ordered something to make my stuff that I'm going to sell, it will arrive in time, okay? The worry I have on a daily basis have nothing to do with carbon, okay? Now, if there's a regulation that says when you change this machine, it has to be carbon-free, well, I don't worry. I do it because I have to do it. And then I think about my employees. If I don't have a regulation, it requires me to take a decision, to take a risk that I would not take otherwise, and I won't take it. Okay? That's how it works in real life. Okay? So you need strong leadership to clarify that this is where we're going. And if you don't do this right investment, if you don't do this, you're out of luck, you're out of path, and this is what happened in countries that really move forward. You look at the UK, and don't tell me the UK has a better government than we have, okay? If you looked at the recent prime ministers and prime ministers, you see that not everything is rosy there. But it's moving on that because it decided it was moving, and it put the right push so everybody understands they have to move. It's not a question, should I or should I not, okay? The question is, you move, period, because that's where we'll be in 2050. As I said, the most effective way, we don't see any way for Canada to reach its goal of 40% to 40% reduction in 2030 without significantly reducing the production or emissions in oil and gas, and for us, it's really the emissions. Okay. It's important to understand, that's the last, I kind of put it, not everybody is affected the same, okay? And that's important politically, okay? This is emissions per capita when I remove the energy production. Okay, let's remove energy production in all places, so that helps Alberta and Saskatchewan. It doesn't look like it. Okay, those are emissions per capita. So the lowest is about Quebec, Quebec at 10 tons per capita, and the largest is Saskatchewan at 48 tons per capita, without counting the oil and gas industry. Okay. So clearly, when you go to zero, you see that the challenges are not the same in all the provinces. So Newfoundland is about at 18 ton, okay? And it's not the same sectors that are touched. So if I'm at the federal level and I'm putting in directions or directives or regulation, not everybody will be hit the same, okay? And politically, I mean, I'm a modeler, I don't care, okay? But politically, if you want to transform what we learn from models into policy, you have to worry about these issues. and see how will you handle that to make sure that some people don't feel like they unfairly hit by this transformation. Okay? Or if they are unfairly hit, how can you compensate in some way or another? Okay? That's a challenge. Okay. So the transport sector, I mean, one thing is important is also, we always say that's personal responsibility. Not always, but you hear that a lot. Okay? It's your responsibility. You have to make the right choices. Okay? Well, it's bogus. Okay? It's bogus. 20% of emissions in Canada are directly related to you, okay, as an individual. 78% are not. So let me explain. What I'm giving you, or myself, is transportation. I'm in charge of what I buy and where I live, okay, so it decides how many kilometers I run every year. And second, how I'm heating my building, my house, okay. I have no responsibility on the way the Université of Montréal is heating its building. So don't give me the responsibility for the fact that they're still using natural gas, okay? It's not my fault. I have no responsibility for the mall. I go to the mall, how to do this. I don't have responsibility on how much packaging is on things delivered, okay? I don't have responsibility really on how my house is being built. I'm not in charge of regulation, okay? How much concrete I have to pour, I have no control on that, okay? Those are systemic emissions that need to be addressed by regulation, by prices, and information. But the citizen cannot have no control on that directly. Okay? So it's important because you need to understand this to make sure that shaming people doesn't go very far. Okay? Doesn't bring us to net zero. Okay? What you need is to do deep transformation of systems. Okay? If you don't want people to drive that much, you have to put regulation on how you do urban planning and make sure that you build and you develop cities where people can walk or take the bus or take the bicycle or whatever. Okay? If you allow people houses to be built all over the place, well, people will buy the houses where they are and will be buying all over the place, for example. Okay? So I'm a strong opponent to this idea that we should blame people, okay? I mean, I can blame you for who you vote for, but that's another story, okay? But the question is, you have to push at the right places, okay? And where you have to do is make sure that governments are moving. Okay. I see time is flying, I guess. Do I have a few minutes or? Yeah, okay. So let me give you just an example. I mean, it's easy to make plans. In fact, it's easy to make targets. It's easy to say we'll reach them. Okay? So the federal government made some modeling, a bit like us. They're not as good as us, but okay. Don't repeat that. They don't like it when I say this. But okay, so I'll just give you an example that means that try to explain to you how the systemic we are talking about. Okay? So its energy, the emission reduction plan the federal published a plan a year ago saying this is where we're going to get our goals. Among things it says in the building sector, we will reduce emissions by 42% between roughly now and 2030. 42%, okay? And they support that by their own modeling. We decided just to do back-of-the-envelope calculation. Physicists are good at that, okay? Reducing by 42% means that, first, no new building built in Canada should be heated with fossil fuel. None, okay? Second, you have to, if you do deep retrofit, you don't electrify buildings that are heated with fossil fuels, you need to retrofit 100% of all buildings in Canada in 7 years. I don't know if you called a contractor recently, but thinking you can do that, okay, it's dreaming. Okay? Or you electrify the building. But if you go and look at the plan, if you electrify the building, you need to have more electricity. Not here, but in most places, okay? You need to build new not with fossil fuels. You need to build electricity production facilities with wind or solar or water, okay? And then you have to build the transmission line and get to the houses and transform, okay? that will need 42% of the building. You need to do that. Okay. Explain to me how it can be done in 7 years, given that no province has investment plans to lift the electricity production by any significant level by 2030 today. Okay? So it's nice to do modeling, okay? But you also have to count at one point and sit and say, at the moment, there are huge barriers to doing this. The first thing we need to do is invest in electricity production, okay? Clean electricity production. And even in Quebec, okay, it's not just here. In Quebec, the Hydro-Quebec says you cannot decarbonize building heating in Montreal because we don't have enough lines that come in Montreal, okay? Which is crazy. I mean, invest in the lines and that's it, okay? So that's the issue. So if we have problems in Quebec with bringing electricity, imagine Ontario, imagine, Saskatchewan. It's much worse. And because it's a question of system, of size. If I'm a single house and I say I want to decarbonize, I can do some cheap insulation, put a heat pump, and I'm done, okay? I don't have to ask anybody. But now if I have to do the whole city, then it's a different thing. Now I need more electricity, I need to change to have more, bigger distribution network, I need to make sure that I get the electricity production. It's not something that happens magically. You need to plan it, to invest it. And just that you know, we're not the only, it's a news, probably you don't know that, but we're not the only one in the world looking to build windmills, for example. Okay? That's kind of every single other country in the world is planning the same investments. And if you haven't heard, there are problems of supply, of chain of supply around the world. So everybody will be looking after the same engine, the same rotors, the same electronics, which means that prices will go up, and it will be long to get this delivered. Okay? And we have no plans, so we are not ahead. Okay? And that's the same thing in electricity. I mentioned it. Okay? So if you need to plan, you need to do it correctly and have a real strategic view. You cannot just wish, like the federal government did it, that it will happen. Okay? You need to have a real quantitative analysis and then build a real strategy to transform this. And that is not only at the federal level, because electricity energy is in the provincial matter, so provinces have to embark on this and plan and support this transition. Okay? No province, for example, is planning properly for the arrival of the electric vehicles. Okay? And that might be a problem. You know, if you have big blackouts and 20% of the population has electric vehicles, what do we do? At the moment, zero planning for that. Okay? So there are issues. I don't want to discourage you, okay? But the point is that it's possible. There are countries who are moving on that. But we have to stop pretending. We have to stop throwing money left and right. We have to stop doing programs and do real strategies. Okay? Programs is I do this here, I do this there, I do this there, without looking at the real impact and the real leverage of all this together. We need to move on that. Okay? And we're still not there. And that's what we're working on. Now, the things I created at the beginning, no, I'm not the only one, but there's people trying to bring governments to do this type of approach that makes sense. Okay? And so we've written a lot of reports on these things. Okay? Of course, writing reports has limitations, so I'm aware of that. But we try to work with civil servants and others to kind of push the ideas. It's not easy. We don't have a tradition in Canada of being very strategic in the way we move. Okay, so that's an issue. But if you don't manage to sleep at night, we have plenty of stuff to help you. Okay, do that at least. And if you want to look at the outlook, we have numbers. We showed you some for the province, but all over the place. So let me stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm thinking we may have some questions, so I have to pass the microphone around for that. So who'd like to be first? Chris, you're up front.
Hi, thank you very much. A quick question. You mentioned that in your modeling, the transport was especially problematic. In the models, how did you break that down? Are we thinking of ships and aircraft being the worst compared to cars? Because it seems like lumping those together is the...
No, it's all decomposed in sub and subsectors. We have, no, I don't know, 15 different types of trucks in bigger Tron and different. So it's very decomposed. The issue is heavy transportation. We don't have solutions, as well as maritimes and aviation. At the moment, we don't have cost for solutions, alternatives.
Thank you very much. That was really an excellent presentation. I have a concern. I was speaking to a young man, a 22-year-old who's just graduating now from business school and setting up his career in the oil and gas industry. And certainly our own premier is, trying to put a rosy light on that whole notion, just calling it green and hoping that label sticks. But I entered a discussion with him and I said, we talked a little bit about climate change, but he said, if we don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. And I said, well, that is exactly why there are no fish in the ocean. And so I guess my question to you is, how do you counteract that attitude? Or what can you say to help?
I mean, the first thing is that we need to reduce consumption. Okay, no point hitting on. We need to reduce consumption. Okay, first. So we need to transform the system. If the demand is not there, prices will go down. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second, we need to offer alternatives. Okay, there was no alternatives to bids now, for example, in Newfoundland. What project was there on the table that says this is a real development project for Newfoundland and Labrador. And so you need to construct real alternative so people see a way out. If there's no way out, they will stay. My own feeling is that given how it's been going over the last few years, we should say the poorer countries in Africa, for example, make some money out of oil and gas today, and the richer countries should move on, okay, and take risk and develop the technologies and spend too much money on technology so that they will price, okay. But locally, you need alternatives. You need alternatives. You need absolutely to offer. This one is shaking. This one. Okay. So you really need to present other future. And for example, a lot of people, when Stephen Guilbeault signed for the bids now, said, no, you're a sellout. But I'm sorry, when a project like this gets on the table of the Minister of Environment, it's too late. Okay? What you should do is the first day you say, this type of project is not acceptable, bring me another one. Okay? And focus on developing alternatives. I don't know what are the alternatives for Newfoundland and Labrador, okay? So I cannot tell you, oh, that should be your industry. I'm from outside of here. I have zero competence in developing a business, okay? I'm a university professor. But this is where you have to put efforts, okay? And to diversify, because if you say, for example, I'll take an example at random, green hydrogen will be the salvation in the economy of Newfoundland. It's a big risk given that nobody has been producing it or selling it. So just in case, let's think of 2 or 3 other kind of promising ways of moving forward, just in case it doesn't work, okay? But again, it's easier said than done, we know, otherwise, no, it would have been done. But that's where the efforts should go. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the, does that work? Thank you both for the talk and for doing this work. It's important. I assume your model assumes that our global economy works as well as it does now. With climate change, we can assume that extreme events will disrupt disrupted at different places. Have you tried to run the model and see what kind of impact that would have?
It's very hard in our models to do this. What we have to do is it's called proxies. So we have to suppose, for example, that the economic growth is not the same, for example, or you have the population changes. So it's very hard. It's also because we model Canada and the US only. So everything else has to be kind of forced in. So we can do that, but it's really from outside the model that we have to test that.
On the modeling, is it all from a macro perspective? Or is it broken down into like cities compared to townships, like on a micro scale?
It's sectorial. So we say there's that many buildings that are like this, of this types in Canada. So we break them by provinces, but that's it. We don't have cities and geographical differentiation at the moment. Okay.
And then on the, well, I just, I don't know if you want to switch, but, so you have them by sectors, and then those sectors have a certain carbon weight to them? Is that how that is done? Or how do you calculate like on the carbon side of that?
We first look at every energy demand. So this is based on the energy service, okay? So that industry needs that much heat to produce that much stuff. And then we say now the technologies to produce heat can be natural gas, oil, electricity, biomass, and all this. We put costs on all this. And as we move forward in investment, we decide which is done in terms of best cost overall. So for my industry, it might be more costly to do this. But if it's overall for the economy is cheaper, that's what we select, okay, in this model. It's really an economy-wise optimization, not decision by decision.
Thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask, currently as young people, we're facing an epidemic of climate anxiety, climate depression, and climate suicidal ideation. And I wanted to ask from your perspective as someone who is deep into this field, what do you think the odds are that the best case scenario actually turns out?
So let me take a step back, okay? My parents grew up in 2040, okay? In 1940, sorry, during the Second World War. And I can tell you there was some anxiety at that moment too, about what would happen at the world, okay? So there were people in the 70s who grew under the specter of a nuclear war that would destroy the world. So anxiety has been around for young people almost forever, okay? So I'm not saying it's not true, but I think if you are complacent for that, it prevents you from moving, okay? The world is moving, period, okay? The world is not disappearing in 30 years. So what you have to do is channel this into positive energy and saying, I want to do something for that, at the level of that I'm capable of doing. You will unlikely be the one saving the world only by yourself, okay? I don't have any expectation of saving the world or even saving Canada. What I'm saying is, what can I do the best of my capability? I'm not responsible for what's beyond my capacities, okay? And I think that's the more constructive way of moving, okay? If you ignore it and then you feel bad about it, that's not the right approach. Now, find a way where you can feel that you're contributing to your level and accept it, okay? If you can do more, you do more. But at one point, you cannot save the world by yourself, okay? And the world will be there in 2050. It will be hotter, there will be disasters, okay? But that's not the end of civilization. And if we don't solve it by 2050, we solve it in 2055, 60, 65, we'll still have been doing a lot of progress, okay? So the odds that we reach our targets by 2050, for me, is 0, okay? But that's not an excuse. I mean, I'm not doing this because I think we'll get there. I'm trying, can we at least get on the path to change things deeply and seriously so that we're moving there? And fine if we can then accelerate, but let's first start moving, okay? But there's not the point of saying, will we miss 50 or not? If I just focus on that, I won't do anything today. So that's, I mean, you don't have to take my recommendation for anything more, than what I'm saying. So you can trash it and do like you wish, but at least that's how I think we should think it.
So along those lines, you mentioned a few gaps that you see. Say we don't have technologies for direct air capture at large scale and heavy transportation. Did you find other gaps that might appeal to, say, physicsy audiences?
Gaps, yeah. There's a lot of gaps. I mean, for example, in processes, okay? So what do we do with aluminum? What do we do with cement? What do we do with steel? So what do we do with agriculture? Okay, so those are sectors where we need also to think. And again, it doesn't mean there's no solution. It means we need to invest seriously in looking for these solutions and testing these solutions. Okay. And that's what I think. But those are the main gaps. I mean, in buildings, we know what to do. Okay, it could be better, but we have all the technologies today, for example. In some other sectors, we also have it, but we know how to produce electricity. It's not perfect. We don't know how to store everything, but we know how to move forward there.
You had those plots where you broke everything down by province.
Yeah.
And when I initially looked at that, I thought, oh, wow, those dirty Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Yeah.
But when you really look at that, so it's per capita, which if it wasn't per capita, it would look a lot different. And a lot of what they have there, so agriculture, I mean, they're feeding all of Canada.
Yes, but they also have transportation and electricity, so they could improve there, okay? And heat production. So I agree. That's what, but it's important to understand this. I agree with you. We have to look at this and say, what cannot be done, and how can we move forward? And it's not a question of blaming. It's just saying that's the challenge.
Yeah,
okay?
I get that, but also I'm just looking at what I was thinking, because then I thought, oh wow, Quebec is doing really good. But if you take out the denominator, Quebec is got transportation as well.
That's correct. But it's there per capita. But the point is, to me, per capita is important, okay? Because otherwise, why do we do something that China doesn't move? That's always what people say. I mean, come on. We have to move, and the per capita, I think, is a decent number, but I agree. It's not perfect, because if you do all the dirt in one province for the benefit of everybody, you cannot make them pay for everybody. That's also the nice thing about net zero, I would say. Zero has to be zero. And so you don't care where it is. You say, this we have to find a way to bring it to zero. Okay? You don't have to penalize people, but agriculture will have to find a way to get it to zero, wherever it is. And that means pouring more money there than in other provinces, because that's where the problem is. Okay? It's also what that means.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could clarify or offer a few more comments on the idea of negative emissions processes. So what I understood from the talk was that you burn biomass, like I guess wood, and then you try to use that heat for something productive and then capture the emissions and then bury them. So to me, that sounds like that produces no emissions, not negative. Is the idea that you get the negative emissions when the trees regrow?
That's
and
correct.
That's what takes
that's
the
correct.
carbon out of the
So,
and then my follow-up question is, so you said like Newfoundland has lots of biomass. It seemed like these negative emissions processes were a key part of the model. Is this using like a significant fraction of Canadian forests? Like how much biomass burning are we talking about?
essentially what is considered available today as waste. Okay, it's not cutting new trees. It's cutting the trees that would be cut and then getting the waste out of that. Okay, this is not, that's how we compute. But it's also, there's a lot of question as to, because how fast is the tree growing? how much is it capturing? I mean, this thing, and we just have a project that we are started now with Environment Canada to look at that, because it's not so clear that it is really so negative than we're computing. Okay. Because trees take time to grow, they die, they burn. I mean, there's all type of things that can happen to them.
On the carbon capture side, there's only those two mediums that are recognized as carbon capture, or is there other processes or things that companies can do or implement that would add to that net zero?
I mean, you can just eliminate the emissions. So if you have a process, for example, you can say, let's do iron transformation into steel, but without using, just with electricity. Then you don't produce any emissions. So you don't need to capture them. So there's also this. Otherwise, you have to capture the emissions at the place where they're made and sequester them. So typically it's heavy industry. You won't do this in your house or at the back of your car. So that limits where you can do that.
Okay, I think there's a reception down below that we should go to now and give our speaker a bit of a break, and let he get some refreshments, and then you can in that area. But before we do, I'd ask you to give him one more round of appreciation.
Thank you.
Thanks again, and thanks everyone for. Yes, join us at the reception, please.